Let's start with the economy and interest rates and the narrow path that central banks, including our own Reserve Bank, are now navigating to avoid a plunge into recession or an economic downturn. Until this week, it was 12 years since the Reserve Bank raised rates in 3 consecutive months. But more increases are on the way and eventually they will hurt. But the cure for these cost increases, higher wages, might also be the curse if they get out of control. As people take to the streets demanding higher wages, it's a reflection that large parts of the community think that times are getting tougher, that their costs are rising too fast, their wages too slow.
You know, we do understand, we do appreciate that the skyrocketing costs of essentials like groceries and petrol and electricity and other essentials as well is putting extreme pressure on on household budgets, and that this interest rate rise today will add to the pain.
There's just one thing on evidence right now. The rate rises have not yet hit Australian spending. Retail sales have been at record levels for the past 5 months. Job advertisements show there are more vacancies available than there are unemployed people to fill them. It's boom time stuff. But eventually, something has to give.
And that's basically what the Reserve Bank is trying to do, to tiptoe along the path to bring the spending down without terrifying families too much about what happens next.
As the Reserve Bank tiptoes, it's also hoping inflation disappears as quickly as it arrived. After all, if oil prices jump from $100 to $120 a barrel, that's 20% inflation. But if the following year oil stays at $120 a barrel, that's zero inflation. On oil, this week, there was a clue inflation will ease as prices fell below $100 US a barrel amid worries about a global recession.
You know, we're still in the midst of other issues with, say, gas and electricity. But certainly when it comes to the oil market, which is globally driven, there is certainly a case that we may see prices fall for the remainder of 2022.
All this has caused bond market interest rates to ease here and around the world in recent weeks. That's an anticipation that if there is a recession or economic downturn, central banks might have to do another U-turn and start cutting rates, maybe by as early as late next year.
They could, however, go too hard. And you could see even those marvellous retail numbers we had underscored today start to weaken. You could see the even more marvellous unemployment rate, essentially the lowest in half a century, start to go up again. And walking that path between going too hard and causing a slowdown or even a recession, and not going hard enough and having to continue, if you like, to keep an interest rate squeeze on for longer. That stagflation scenario, they're trying to aim between the two.
For while oil prices and energy shocks might have started this inflation outbreak, the bigger problem is wages inflation. It's harder for the Reserve Bank and other central banks to squeeze out of their economies.
The Reserve Bank's tasked with trying to keep it under control. There's only so much they can do about floods, about wars in the Ukraine, but they do have to make sure that the underlying economy is not overheating, and that's best represented by our unemployment rate and, of course, what you just mentioned, the wage threat. And we're seeing industrial action become more broad-based, more common, wage claims going up. This is the big inflation risk for Australia now, is wages and inflation getting entrenched.
It's going relatively hard, relatively fast, because it gets scared that inflation starts to get cemented in place, that wages start to follow, prices start to follow wages. And that circularity is a real risk.
And apart from money markets, banks are already signalling where they think interest rates are headed. 2- and 3-year fixed-rate mortgages that were around 2% at the start of this year are now between 5 and 6.5%.
I think that they have finally peaked, or at least near the peak, we would hope. They could start coming back down, hopefully. In fact, the cash rate, forecasters believe, yes, it might hit 2.5, 2.6% by February next year, but we also could see a correction by the RBA.
But any forecasts about interest rates should be viewed with wages at the back of your mind. If the protests in the streets and wage claims to come are any indication, higher inflation and interest rates could be more sticky than many find comfortable, including the Reserve Bank Board.
No teachers,